Welcome to the Regen Brands podcast. This is a place for brands, retailers, investors, and other food system stakeholders to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Ryan Pintado-Vertner, who is the founder and CEO at Smoketown. Smoketown is a boutique brand consultancy that helps visionaries, mission-driven brands, and nonprofits maximize their growth and positive impact without one compromising the other. They use empathy to solve complex marketing challenges for their clients who are creating more justice, generosity, equity, and regeneration in the world. Smoketown is supporting regenerative agriculture with their recently released white paper, Unlocking Demand for Regenerative, a crowdsourced blueprint for accelerating consumer demand for regenerative agriculture. Now, it will come as no surprise to anyone who has listened to this show before to hear that we are convicted in our belief that we absolutely need to figure out how to improve our ability to increase consumer awareness and demand for regenerative products. Well, Ryan shares that conviction with us, and this white paper was his attempt to explore that concept and share his findings with the community. And boy, did he deliver. This white paper is full of really insightful takeaways and recommended actions to take, and Ryan is here with us today to break it all down. You'll also learn about his background as an activist and big CPG brand builder, his previous work at Smoketown with mission-driven brands, and his regen awakening that led him to producing this blueprint for driving change. Join us as we break down how the regenerative community can increase consumer empathy, refine the messaging frame, double down on loyalty and share of wallet, and boldly collaborate for big awareness. This one was legit, folks. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have our friend Ryan from Smoketown joining us. So welcome, Ryan.
I can't believe I'm here. I'm like, how's it go? Like long time listener, first time caller or whatever. I mean, I can't even believe it.
That's fantastic to hear, man. This is an exciting episode for us because typically, as you know, we are with brands or it's just AC and I. And this will be an interesting episode for us to have sort of like a high level topic to discuss in detail with a third party that isn't a brand. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this episode evolves.
Yeah. And the context there for those that don't know, but if you're following us, you should know at this point. But Ryan produced a white paper called Unlocking Demand for Regenerative, a crowdsourced blueprint for accelerating consumer demand for regenerative agriculture. So we wanted to have him on to talk about all the things that were included in the white paper, some of the feedback he's gotten since then. So we will dive into all of that fun stuff. But before we do, let's let the audience meet Ryan, the human being, the person, the legend himself. So Ryan, please share a little bit about like your personal journey and kind of your work in CPG and what Smoketown is and all that good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. Again, like I'm sincerely honored to get a chance to be here for real. And yeah, so my quick story is, the first half of my adult life, I was an activist that led me to the nonprofit world. There's this quote that Martin Luther King Jr. has that really spoke to me when I was young. He said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And when I heard that, I felt like, okay, that's actually what I'm about. Like, I want to be part of bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice. And then, frankly, I burned out on nonprofit life. I led a nonprofit for a stretch, and I just hit a wall, which is pretty common in that space, actually. Like, burnout is a real thing. And along that path, like I discovered that you can do good and do well at the same time by building social enterprises. So that led me to get an MBA. That led me to discover consumer packaged goods. I literally didn't know what CPG meant. Like I was sitting in a class at UC Berkeley and they kept throwing CPG around, bro. And I had to Google it or whatever we did in the 1900s. So I discovered CPG. I actually kind of fell in love with it, and then did this crazy pivot where I went into big CPG for like 14 years, which no one who knew me coming up in the nonprofit world recognized me. They were like,
Yeah.
he works at Clorox. Like, I don't know what happened to him, and however, like I happened to land at Clorox in a window that was an incredible blessing for me. Like they were probably, I mean, it sounds like I don't know, whatever the term is, like it's easy for me to say that they were great because I was
Yeah.
there, right? So,
Right.
I recognize a certain level of self-interest in that, but I think kind of objectively, Clorox was at its prime in that window that I was there. They were just like 90th percentile on a whole bunch of stuff. So I learned a tremendous amount, and yet and after I left there, I went to another couple of big CPG companies. But the truth is that, that call was still deep, in me. Like that sense that I should be bending the moral arc of the universe was still kind of fundamentally how I was wired. And so Smoketown came about in 2018. So what's that, 6 years and some change, on our way to 7, I guess.
But that 6-year window has been an interesting 6 years.
Listen, like it was like, one thing that I would not advise is to go out on your own for the first time in your whole life,
Yeah.
and a year and a half later have the entire economy shut down. I mean,
Yeah.
my wife Lisa, God bless her, like she had to scrape me up off the floor in 2020. I mean, it was wild, and yet, like we bounced back. Like we actually came back stronger than I expected, and the whole premise behind Smoketown is that there are best in class practices for how to build a brand, how to create demand, how to build brand equity, which ultimately is what creates brand value. There's a playbook for that, and yet there's also some things that startups and early stage brands do amazingly well that big CPG can't figure out. And so my goal was to try to bring the best of what I was trained to do, shed the stuff that doesn't work, and learn and lean in and learn from startups. And so I cut my teeth that way. The team, like we built a bit of a team around us, and the core of what Smoketown does. I mean, folks can go to our website if they want to learn more, of course. But the core of what Smoketown does is we help mission-driven brands make better marketing and innovation decisions, because because those decisions are grounded in consumer empathy. That's our language for understanding consumer behavior and really being dialed into who and what consumers are motivated by. So that's what we do. There's a whole range of services that we have that again, the website speaks to, but it basically comes down to solving complex marketing challenges in a whole range of ways, and in a way that's customized to what each individual brand needs.
Oh yeah, I'm really curious. Like, it sounds like you've created this playbook based on your experience in big CPG, and without spending too much time there, like, what were you doing at Clorox and those other big CPG companies, and what did you decide were like the key elements of that playbook? Are you running a power eye? Are you going shotgun? What's the playbook actually look like?
You just went over my head. I totally, like, I recognize I'm on a football, like I'm talking to people who know football immediately when they start throwing stuff around, and I'm like, I don't know, but I'll answer the question from my marketing nerd brain.
There you go.
Which is, so my role in those companies was always in brand management. So I was at the hub of the wheel of managing demand creation, and usually having some level of responsibility for the P&L. In addition to, so out of 14 years, I think that 8 of the 14 years, I had some level of direct responsibility for innovation strategy and innovation execution. So I'm really, like, have cut my teeth on innovation for a long time. And I'd say the single most important thing that I learned and that I've applied as core to Smoketown's practice is the idea that you have to understand the consumer problem that you solve. Like, deep understanding and reverence and respect and care for who your consumer is, who you serve, what is the job that you do in their lives. Every single decision is better because of that. Every single line of the P&L is improved when you have that depth of understanding, because it just makes decision making better. So there's a lot more that I could go into, but I'd say the cornerstone that distinguishes Smoketown as a brand consultancy from others is our absolute commitment to understanding who is the consumer that we serve, and making decisions from that place.
I love that. And that feels so intuitive. And it also seems so like I've never heard somebody say that out loud in CPG, like focusing on empathy, right?
Yeah.
So that's really, really awesome. And I'm excited to get further into the episode and talk about how we can apply those tactics to the regenerative movement as a whole.
Yeah.
I was having a lightning rod moment to both of the major takeaways of consumer empathy and really focusing on the problem and saying like, we're not doing that very well as a movement. And individually, the brands that are doing really well are doing that really well individually.
Right.
So there's a mixed bag there individually, but collectively, like we need to massively up level both of those things as a community.
Yeah.
Well, I want to take it. So it sounds like we got a brief overview of Act 1, Ryan's time in activism. Act 2, time in big CPG, and then the beginning of Act 3 with Smoketown. And I'm curious, right now you're really focusing on this regenerative innovation or regenerative startup kind of portion of CPG, right? When did regenerative kind of hit your radar, and why did that become important to you?
Yeah. So just before COVID, so that would have been like 2019, very close to when I started Smoketown to begin with. I was invited to be part of the at first advisory board and then eventually the sort of operating board of a regenerative focused fund. It was eventually called Flock. It was a fund raised by Mark Retzloff, who was the founder of Horizon Dairy. He and a handful of other folks who I was getting to know at the time invited me to be part of that effort. And we spent a couple of years trying to pull that off. It eventually merged into another effort, but that was an incredible sort of drink from the fire hose learning opportunity for me. We were at the table, or I should say I was at the table with folks who knew this space exceedingly well. That led to the chance to be an advisor on Trailhead with Trailhead Capital. So they're an investor in this space. I know you guys know them. That gave me another opportunity to continue to learn and cut my teeth. I had the opportunity to meet Julia Collins with Planet Forward and Moonshot, who's a genius, and became a friend and kind of was my guiding, another person who sort of helped guide me into this space. And then I would say all of that led to me deciding that I want to build a practice here. But the real light bulb moment, though, I'd say was about a year ago. I prior to that, I saw it as something important. I saw it as something that I wanted to be part of. But then, like this thing happened where I was reading a lot. I was listening to a bunch of y'all's podcasts. I was sort of consuming a ton of content alongside kind of deepening my own spiritual practice. And this, like, I woke up one morning and it was like, all of these things are the same thing. Like like the bigger picture for what regeneration actually means and stands for was so closely aligned to where my spiritual practice was leading, which was also closely tied into that whole idea of bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice, because you care about justice because you care about people. And so it all just kind of started to come together, and I realized, oh, okay, what's actually happening here is I figured out that this is the next phase of my life. Like this is not just something kind of dope that's happening in the food space that I want to be a part of. No, this is actually what I'm about. So, next thing I know, we got like 4 backyard chickens. We're like, we're rotational, cropping in our ridiculously small garden. I'm growing hairy vetch for those who are like really want to nerd out on this. But it just became not just a thing that's interesting, but it really became the thing.
Man, I love that. And I think what I love most about it is Justin Mayers, the founder of Kettle and Fire, he talks about regenerative and how it's rooted in like a foundational truth.
Yeah,
And when you truly start to understand that, it's like, whoa, okay, this really does make sense at like a deeper level. To your point, that it
exactly,
kind of aligns with truths in other capacities as well.
exactly.
Unlike, and I don't mean to like totally throw any specific industry under the bus, but unlike like lab grown meat, like
Yeah,
okay, I can kind of see some of the benefits there, but like, is that really the right thing? Whereas when you
right.
truly understand regenerative ag, you're like, yeah, this is what we need to be doing. And then as you were saying, that, it's like, man, you're reading, you're on your own spiritual path, you had the light bulb moment. It's like, how do we get everybody else to have the light bulb moment, right? And I think that's what we're
Right.
going to talk about on today's episode, which is super
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But I will say though, like it's the fact that so many people have some version of that light bulb moment though is extremely
Hmm.
promising. Like that
Yeah.
that suggests that we're talking about something that's operating at a different wavelength, right?
Yeah.
And is one of the reasons why I think the demand potential here is extraordinary.
Totally, because
Yeah.
once you understand it, there's no going back. It's like I call it the vampire.
Hmm.
Once you get bit, like you're there for life.
Hmm.
It's like you can't change.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're in.
There's like I was watching a YouTube video where Matthew McConaughey was getting interviewed, and he was talking about we have to live life looking forward, and it's a mystery. But when we look
Mm.
back, it's a science. It's really easy to say, "Oh, I did
Mm.
that. I went here. Like blah blah blah. This makes sense." And
Right.
it's kind of funny, like the three people on this call, how we all got here, because I know all of our stories. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
very easy to look back and say it's a
Yeah.
science, But I
Yeah.
know while we were all in it, it was a mystery, right? As
Yeah.
we're like
Yeah. Yeah.
moving forward, living life. So just
Yeah.
interesting takeaway there.
Yeah.
Ryan, I want to kind of move into the white paper by maybe sharing like why did you decide to do a white paper? I mean,
Mm.
you and I had some preliminary discussions. We had a really good chat at Expo in March.
Yeah.
And my takeaways from the, before you did the white paper were like, this guy just wants to be of service. Like he really wants to be helpful to this work in some capacity where he can use his unique experience and skill set. But what was the journey like from like the inspiration to the execution?
Mm. First of all, thank you for that. I think that is sincerely where I was coming from. It
Yeah.
was is there a way for me to learn and serve in the same motion? And the inspiration though for it was with everything that I was reading and seeing, including by the way, listening to a whole bunch of y'all's podcast, was it felt like there were lessons being learned and things being observed kind of in pockets and silos. And there wasn't a lot of capacity for sharing across.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
in fact, you guys reached exactly the same conclusion
Yep.
in an episode that I started. And AC knows this story. Like I started that episode. I forget which episode it was. It was one of the first ones where it was just the two of you and you didn't have a guest. And I didn't finish that episode though. And so it was towards the end where you had exactly the same like revelation that, oh man, we need people to talk to each other. And so I had that idea kind of in parallel, and one thing led to another. And I brought a team member on to sort of help write the white paper, and she's like, AC and Kyle literally say that this exact thing should happen in episode such and such and such. And I was like, oh no, am I ripping them off? Like I don't intend to. And so anyway, like it's a funny story for just how like lots of things came together where I think multiple folks had a recognition that through like not because there's not sincere interest in collaboration and sharing. It's just like people are at capacity. You've got all of these folks who are leading emerging brands and figuring things out with scrappy teams. They just don't have the capacity to share. And so the spirit of the white paper was how can I take the burden off of a lot of folks, listen, very intentionally, distill that down into a document, and then re-release that as a bit of collective wisdom.
Love that, man, and I think you did, and I think you nailed it. I remember I
Thank you.
was reading the was reading the Smoketown white paper on my phone I can't remember what airport, in preparation for the town hall. And I was like, man, this is really good. There's some really killer insights in here. But I'm
Thank you.
curious from your perspective throughout that process, you had listened to a bunch of the episodes, you had done quite a bit of your own research.
Yeah.
Was there like a specific or two or three aha or light bulb moments for you where you really said like, whoa, this is like a really deep theme I'm noticing across the board? What was the interview experience like for you, and what were those moments?
Yeah. One thing that I had kind of a strong hypothesis about, or sort of suspicion around, is that consumers, like, let me take a step back. So most regen brands talk about regenerative as like through the lens of sustainability. They talk about it through the lens of restoring something that's broken, or improving something that investing in climate. That tends to be the frame, and that's fine. But I've had enough experience in focus groups with consumers, and digesting consumer research, that people are just not that altruistic. That tends not, that's maybe 10%, 5%, 7% of the US population is sincerely making decisions from that place. And even there, I'd be sort of somewhat skeptical of it. I just was like, I'm not sure that that's gonna be the way this scales.
Yeah.
And after the conversations that I had, we interviewed about 30 people across 18 companies. It turned out that I wasn't the only one having that observation. Lots of people, even though they're currently anchored in sustainability as the story, and many, if not most, of folks engaged in this space, sustainability is fundamental to why they care about it. That's what brought them to it. There's a lot of folks who are like, but I'm not sure that takes us from today's level of awareness and demand to what needs to be true. I mean, if you believe Project Drawdown, like I think their estimate is something like 40% of arable land needs to be managed regeneratively in order for it to be the carbon sink that we need for it to get to numbers like that. It's not the collective wisdom was, it's probably not through that lens. So that's just one example of sort of an observation that I had early on, or something that I just kind of wondered about, that over the course of multiple conversations became an insight that then translated into the paper.
Yeah, I mean, I think our stance at this point is there's two really important things we need to do. Like, there's two really important bridges we need to cross. One is the bridge from altruism to self-interest, right, as a movement, and the next is the bridge from defining to marketing, right? Those are two very different activities. And so right now we're relying on altruism to drive change, and we're trying to fight over the definition, and we need to rely on self-interest to drive change and really focus on marketing and driving awareness and true demand versus defining. I think those are deeply underpinned in the findings of the report, which just to clarify for the listeners, like what Ryan did was he interviewed 20 plus people, mainly brands, but some other regenerative kind of NGOs and influencers on the state of affairs, and developed what I thought was a very interesting kind of methodology to the report. It was really truly a blueprint with recommendations. It wasn't just research and findings. And to just come back for one thing before we go really into the depth of the report, what we were talking about earlier, which is like, we had reached the same conclusion, and that's why we're doing the work that we're doing, why we published the State of Regenerative CPG report, because we had all these insights from the podcast that were disparate and only accessible if you listen to 70 hours of podcasts, but we have to get them into the right medium where we filter and synthesize into actually kind of actionable insights. However, we've only been able to do that at really a high level across like all regen brands. Like, that was the State of Regenerative CPG report. And so what this white paper did was it did that same sort of methodology, but specifically about the marketing and demand driving function, which is like our goal across the board, whether that's us doing it or other people doing it or doing it in collaboration. It's like, we have to reach that level of research, insight creation, and then dissemination to the community, and then activation. I don't know where all those words just came from, but I think that sounded pretty good, actually. So hopefully that makes sense to people. But there was this just beautiful kind of natural ebb and flow where you were able to support what we do, and we were able to support what you do in a very natural and kind of cohesive and additive way.
For sure.
Yeah, just want to recognize that.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you. I feel the same.
Cool.
Well, before we dive too far into the actual report, I just want to share. I think it was Expo West, not the most recent one, with the one prior. AC and I were sitting next to each other during a Nielsen panel, and they shared these are like the top 10 consumer, the things consumers care about that drive purchase behavior. And I'm pretty sure the top
hierarchy of needs, but for consumers.
Yeah, basically. And I think it was, and this goes back to your point, Ryan, about how like sustainability is not the leading thing, right? That's not the one. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure the top 3 were taste, price, and convenience.
Yeah.
And number 8 was sustainability.
Yeah, and that tends to be I've seen probably a dozen studies that all reach some version of that same conclusion, at least in food and beverage.
And what I love about these different sources coming to the same conclusion is it feels like it's really validating, right? You're doing a qualitative interview work and soliciting feedback qualitatively to come up with a quantitative answer. And then when somebody like Nielsen, who's like just pure quantitative, comes up with that same answer, it really feels like it's rooted in truth.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, let's dive into the actual report. So we talked about some of your aha moments when you were soliciting the interviews and getting the feedback. AC did a really good job of breaking down the methodology. Is there anything AC missed in what you all put into the report itself?
No, I think he distilled it. I think he definitely framed it up. I mean, it's probably worth throwing out a few of the folks who we talked to, or just sort of the companies that they represented, so that people have an appreciation for who the report attempts to reflect voices from. So we talked with, Rylan, co-founder at Kiss the Ground. We talked with the marketing leads at Simply, at Lundberg Family Farm, at Applegate. So it's a mix of startups who are grinding it out and at the bleeding edge of it, with a couple of OGs who have been doing this for a while and maybe even have reached a certain level of scale, close to a tipping point, along with a couple of sort of like key industry stakeholders who while they don't own a brand per se, are incredibly important and influential in how we think about the consumer interface with Regen. And so I feel completely, frankly, appreciative of AC for opening a bunch of doors to introduce me to folks who would have otherwise been like, who's this dude? And why is he asking me, like, why is he going to ask me a bunch of questions? I think it was a good partnership in that respect.
Yeah, AC's got a killer regen network, man. He knows everybody. I'll be like, hey man, I just talked to this person. He's like, yeah, dude, I know him. I talked to him like 6 months ago. I'm like, okay, my bad, whatever.
Exactly.
But so we already discussed that one of the key, like, biggest takeaways from the white paper was the need for collaboration. We already talked about why a lot of these brands are not collaborating. But Ryan, from your perspective, tell us why collaboration among these various stakeholders can be such an unlock for the movement as a whole.
For sure. I think that what was a broadly felt sentiment is, wow, do we have a lot of work to do? There was a lot of folks who were in this work or in this space would refer back to organic as like a bit of an analog, right? So what happened with it, and where do we need to do better, and where are we doing worse? And one of the things when you look back, with hindsight 2020, or as AC put it earlier, like you look back and everything looks like science. It took decades to reach the level of scale that we are today. And what some folks who were sort of like present for that movement would say is that collaboration earlier would have been helpful to accelerate that pace. And so I think that the first observation from folks is, this is a heavy lift, and we have an actual clock. Like we don't get to just have this take as long as it happens to take. Like we're actually under the gun here when you look at it from a climate standpoint. So that was the first piece. And then the second piece, I would say, and this very much reminds me of my nonprofit days, when people, and Kyle, you spoke to this in the way that Kettle and Fire's founder talks about it. When people are coming to the space, because there's so many layers of truth embedded in the idea of regeneration, the mindset and the openness tends to be collaborative and positive. There's obviously, like, there's a limit to that, and there's plenty of drama, but it reminds me a lot of the nonprofit space, I guess, is my point, where you have people with good intention aiming at something much bigger than themselves and recognizing that they can only accomplish that thing that's bigger than themselves if they find allies. So I think that is the core of what I came away feeling so inspired by, in terms of the collaborative potential here. Now, what it actually takes to unlock that collaboration, considering busy schedules, stressed out leaders, meaningful disagreements, philosophical and otherwise. I'm not saying it's going to be like a walk in the park, and y'all have built, a set of institutions that are going to help navigate that. But at a minimum, the intention and the possibility is there, which I think is beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. AC, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we've been sort of disappointed by is, since we've been doing this work, it's almost felt like the desire to have that collaboration was not there, or it was actively being worked against. I think we're hitting a tipping point there, which is exciting. I'm going to try and break something down here that I don't know if I'm going to explain really well, so just bear with me here for a second.
Just hold on tight. Hold on for the ride. There we go.
It corresponds to the need for collaboration and also the theories of change that you presented. Mm-hmm. So Ryan presented 4 theories of change to open the white paper, which were the farmer-led theory, the electric car theory, the consumer-led theory, and the co-creation theory, which we're not going to dive into all of them. People can read the white paper if they want to get the full scoop. But the main takeaway there is that there's this continuum of the need for consumer demand across those 4 offered pathways. Right. And you reach the same conclusion that we have, which is consumer demand is not a silver bullet, but it is an essential piece to some degree. To that degree, we probably don't know exactly what the number is, but like we have to do that to some degree to solve for this thing. Yeah. And I think one of the challenge, if you believe that to be a truth and you believe that the collaboration needs to happen, that I'm wrestling with, I think that we're wrestling with, and this is the way I've been kind of stating the work that we do to people. It's there's 2 parallel paths, there's 2 parallel races being run at once. One is the collective path and one is the individual path. And on the collective path, we have to unite and collaborate to go figure out how to market regenerative as this collective thing and figure out what the ceiling for that is in terms of awareness and demand, right? Mm-hmm. Collective, that's like collective task. But on an individual perspective, like brands have to use regenerative to hitch their marketing wagons to things that actually drive purchase, which aren't regenerative. It's the outcomes of regenerative, which that's a little bit different in execution. And we have to do both at the same time. And I think that's sometimes just difficult and confusing. And I hope I'm articulating that well enough to be understood. But I find that to be a big point of opportunity, but also where some of the friction comes in.
Right. And part of the challenge that we heard, especially from the earlier stage founders, is they feel like today they have to do both.
Yeah, no doubt.
And on a shoestring budget with, while raising money and managing cash flow and building a supply chain, which y'all's state of the industry, maps out quite admirably, right? So I think that is very real, and getting a bit more intentional and organized around, okay, we over here are going to handle this part of it.
Yeah.
And y'all can handle this part of it, rather than everyone thinking that they have to do everything. I believe it'll ultimately be, if we can pull that off, it'll ultimately be a huge relief, particularly for those early and middle stage companies that just frankly didn't have the capacity to do that first part of what you described, AC, anyway.
Yeah, no doubt. We talked about this a lot on a ton of episodes, but it's so hard to be a startup CPG company, period.
Yeah, exactly.
Stack on top of that all of the challenges to be a regenerative startup CPG brand, and it just is exponentially more difficult, right? So Ryan, to your point, like these folks don't have the, number one, bandwidth, let alone everything else. Like there's a ton of problems the movement in totality hasn't been able to solve. Like how can we expect any individual brand to solve these problems, in a silo? So I think this has been a really great kind of overview to like the power of collaboration and why it's so critical for this particular group of constituents, and how it can really move the needle. Because if we can figure out how to get these brands to collaborate and increase the consumer demand that AC was just talking about, like that is an actionable way for people to vote with their dollar, which translates to more arable land converting to these regenerative practices that have the benefits we want to have for the climate.
Yep.
In addition to increasing biodiversity and human health and all the other cascading benefits that come from implementing regenerative practices.
Mm-hmm.
We've set this thing up pretty magically, but let's get into the real nitty gritty here. And as we've said, the layout of the white paper was really a blueprint. So you were offering kind of actions to be taken. And there were 4 key elements, Ryan, that you listed in the white paper. The first one was increase consumer empathy. The second was refine the messaging frame. The third one was double down on loyalty and share of wallet. And the fourth one was boldly collaborate for big awareness. So we know people can go read the full white paper and we encourage them to do so. But for the sake of just basic understanding for the podcast, let's have you kind of describe each of those for a few minutes and some of the action steps that you presented, and then we'll riff on each one and we'll go through all 4.
Yeah, perfect. So first one, to increase consumer empathy. The consensus view here is that we as a movement don't really have a deep enough understanding of consumer motivations, behaviors, attitudes when it comes to regenerative. And therefore, we don't actually know what combination of messages and what approach to storytelling is likely to increase a consumer's interest and actually move them through the full purchase funnel. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks are doing great work experimenting here, so I don't mean to suggest that nothing has been figured out over the course of experimentation. Obviously, it has, but I think that the collective perception is, gosh, we would be climbing learning curves faster and getting to better marketing sooner if we had a deeper understanding. And then the second sort of part of that is that among folks who have done primary consumer research, and there are a handful, they're not necessarily sharing the results of that research broadly, which is, to be clear, totally normal in the world of consumer research. You treat consumer research like it's proprietary, but in this case, we actually are all better off if we collectivize that knowledge, because every brand can climb its learning curve more efficiently and build this space better together. So that's the big observation, and therefore the recommended actions here were about, hey, if you've done a study, figure out how to share that study's findings. There's organized ways to do that we're trying to help create. There's more informal and disorganized ways to do that, but that's the first piece of it. And then the second big action, which I know y'all have a ton of interest in, is we just need to do more primary consumer research. We need to deepen our empathy, and somebody's got to write that check and figure out how to make that happen and do that in a way that supports the whole.
I think you're spot on. And I think it's really important to talk about the importance of the consumer empathy here, because there are so many different value propositions you can hone in on and so many different stories you can tell as a regenerative brand. You can talk about how you're returning, endangered bird species to land, or how you're increasing microbiome in the soil, or, how farmers are being treated better. Like, there's so many different things you can say, but to your point, if those stories aren't the hook that are going to get consumers to purchase the product, you're telling the wrong story. Right. So that's the importance of this research piece, is like, we got to make sure we're telling the right story.
Yeah. It's like, we need to research the research that already exists. Right. Yeah. And then we need to do a lot more research to hit a certain level of research that does not exist yet. And I think there's a really interesting theme here that I don't know what the solution is for, but you basically have like brand led research and you have non-brand led research, right? Which most of the research has come, or that's been shared publicly, from Kiss the Ground, the certifiers like Regenify just came out with something, Purdue University. We're going to do some research. So it's really not coming from a brand perspective. And so making sure that the research done by those folks is actionable to brands and representative of what those brands really need, I think is important. And then finding a way to transparently and equitably and safely share what the brands are doing with other brands in some sort of cooperative fashion, I think is also a huge unlock, but it gets a little bit more competitive and hard to engineer.
Yeah, I think that I totally agree that there is this interesting potential division of labor where if you have some institutions that have resources and capacity to execute research on behalf of a broader group, that actually feels like a pretty smart way to approach it, as long as those folks who are coordinating the research have their feet on the ground and their ear to the ground to understand the questions that need to be answered in order for it to be actionable by the brands. Because it would be a real shame if, $500,000 is invested across multiple organizations and suddenly we have a ton more insight, but it's asking questions and structured in a way that brands can't really make use of it. That would be wasted resources. So figuring out how to sync those up, I think, is a huge opportunity.
Totally. And it's worth mentioning some of the complexity here, right? There are
Mm,
various for profit entities and nonprofit entities existing in the
mm,
same space, all of whom can and should benefit from this sort of research being done. And this is part of why it's so hard to collaborate in today's space,
mhm,
because everybody's trying to capture share of wallet or defend their market share or their
mhm.
ideology or their certification or their brand or their category. So it gets sticky and it's not perfect and it's not. And I can't blame any of these entities for trying to protect their business. I get
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But that's part of why this is so difficult. So to your point, both of your points is like coming up with some sort of mechanism to disseminate this information equitably across all the shareholders is really, really important.
Mhm.
Amen. Cool.
For sure.
I feel like we tackled that one well. Anything else to add on number one?
No, I think we got it. Yeah, I think we got it.
Cool.
So the second element is refining the messaging frame. The core idea here, I actually spoke to it a little bit earlier in the podcast, that the consensus view is that while sustainability focused messaging has its place and it's going to be effective for some consumers and at certain levels of kind of the journey, it's probably not the messaging that's going to scale this to the level that we all believe regen needs and should be scaled. And the reason for that comes down to the fact that of what Kyle described a few moments ago. In food and beverage categories, purchase intent comes down to taste, health, price, convenience in some order. And to the degree that regenerative can align itself with one of those, it's going to scale more effectively. The good news is that there's a ton of evidence that, in fact, regenerative practices can be linked to better nutrition outcomes and eventually, hopefully, better taste outcomes. There's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's a taste connection, but there's a lot of actual hard fact, like real science that demonstrates that healthy soil produces healthier food. And as we have folks in the ecosystem like Audacious and Bionutrient Food Association who are drawing the linkage between regenerative and healthier soil and better nutrition outcomes, it feels like we're on a path to actually unlock what I think what a lot of the folks who I spoke with would see as the holy grail. Like the unlock is to be able to speak to all of those things. Now, to be clear, it's quite complicated. Like in terms of the action steps here, there's sort of low-hanging fruit that I can speak to. But then the bigger unlock of like a brand being able to make brand specific claims tied to its practices it's got to be data driven. The Nutrient Density Alliance has done an amazing job of articulating what that actually requires and looks like. We have to take seriously the litigation environment that we're in. Like there's class action lawyers just waiting for an excuse, to sue a brand and shake them down for a settlement. So we have to be careful here. And having said that, the consumers intuitively understand that healthy soil produces healthier food. That's not an uphill battle. That's not a difficult thing to sell. And there's some low-hanging fruit ways that we can leverage that insight to set the table for regen scaling better in the future.
This is going to be a race on who can talk first because Kyle and I both have 47 thoughts. Kyle, you go first, buddy.
I'm going to take it kind of to big CPG, which is a weird place for me to go. But I'm curious, let's say all the data that you just talked about is done. The brand's got all the right information. They can back up their claims. One of the things that we deal with at Kettle on Fire, like we can't even say, because of USDA and FDA regulations, we can't say good source of collagen on our box. We're legally not allowed to print that. So I'm curious, Ryan, from your experience working with big CPG, what sort of structure, like how do you make sure that the claims you're making are even allowed to be made in the places you're making them?
Yeah. Rather than answering that question directly, I'm going to refer to the report, the white paper that Tina Owens wrote with Nutrient Density Alliance. They released it in January of 2024, and it would be dope if you linked it to, well, it's linked in the actual white paper, and then you guys can link it in the show notes.
Yeah.
It's a clinic on exactly how that should be done. Like, how do you align the right departments internally? Like, what's the research you need to do? What do you need to think about upstream? What do you need to think about downstream? They crush it, but way better than how I could answer that question.
Where we're at tactically with nutrient density, to me, feels like the analogy of when your NBA team sucks and you're tanking for the number one pick, and the guy there's like the top prospect, and you're going to get the number one pick, and they're really good. So it's very black and white. We're going to tank. We suck. We're going to get the number one pick. Nutrient density for soil health is like, we can prove it. We're going to put it on all this food. People are going to buy it because it's healthier. But there's so much gray along the way, to get that person to become the next LeBron James, to get nutrient density to become our LeBron James. Like, there's a lot of ambiguity there. And I think one thing that just needs to be acknowledged is, yes, the Nutrient Density Alliance put out that killer white paper. We love Tina. We love Mary Purdy, who's now kind of leading things over there. And we're going to work with them. We're talking about working with them on some stuff. But we're still just such a long way from it actually being really actionable for brands at a palatable investment of cost and time. Like, yes, they've published in that white paper what the path is, but there's a reason why I haven't seen next to anybody working on it. And it has to do with time and budget and regulatory constraints that we've all talked about. So yes, hopeful. Yes, I think it can work. Let's be very real about those real constraints and try and figure out how we can solve for those as a group. So the nutrient density thing is very helpful, but
so let me make an analogy, because I think that there's a lot of what you just said that I agree with, and yet I believe that there is in fact low-hanging fruit. So let's look at probiotics as a parallel. That's a parallel that I go into more depth on in the white paper itself, because it's very interesting to sort of look at how probiotics scaled and compare that to what we should learn from it. But with probiotics, there is a broad conversation in the media, among influencers, among nutritionists, et cetera, that there's a relationship between the gut microbiome and general health. There's a relationship between the gut microbiome and immunity. So there's a conversation happening there that some brands are participating in, but it's also just it's just happening in the space because it's been nurtured and cultivated over time, which is very different than a specific brand making a claim that their unique strain of probiotics are going to make your immune system stronger. But the brand that has probiotics in it is without question benefiting from that broader conversation that is teaching consumers that there's a relationship between the gut microbiome and health, right? So similarly, my point of view, after having really sort of talked with a bunch of folks and thought about this, is that our goal should be that there's a broad, pervasive conversation happening that teaches consumers the relationship between soil health and food nutrition. That should be as commonly understood as the relationship between gut health and brain health or whatever. That if you establish that, you're essentially fertilizing the ground so that when a brand comes along and drops a seed that says our practices improve soil health, without even that brand having to make the direct connection to better nutrient density outcomes, you've laid the groundwork for people being able to reach that conclusion on their own as that research, sort of gets established to get to the point where Wimby is in fact the next LeBron, right? Like to
yeah.
I tried to get my way back to your analogy.
I like it.
So
I
to me,
appreciate it.
that's the opportunity. How do we create that kind of a groundswell understanding among tens of millions of households that there's a relationship between soil health and nutrient density?
Ryan, I love everything you just said for so many reasons. I'm also going to take this moment to say I'm not going to do an analogy because you two did really, really good ones. So I'm not going to try to stack a third on there. But in particular, I love the way you talked about the probiotic element for two reasons. I mean, number one, regen and soil health is like, like the plant's gut is essentially the soil. So you're essentially saying, and we all on this call know this, but if we can get that link just to cross over for the consumer to understand that, like, oh, wait, like a plant's gut is soil microbiome. I have a microbiome. I need to take care of that. That's an unlock to make people understand this a lot faster, right? Part two, I've been selling natural foods for more than 12 years, and I very specifically remember selling probiotic brands before the cultural zeitgeist moment when that was a regular conversation and after. Now we see prebiotic soda commercials during the Super Bowl, right?
Exactly.
So I think it's a really, really great kind of parallel to point to. And then that begs the question for me is like, okay, like, how do we get that cultural zeitgeist moment to take place so we can cross that threshold so that these brands aren't doing this in the silo and instead they're working as part of this greater movement, right? And we'll continue to have this conversation, but that feels like, okay, that's the moment we need to have as a culture. But bringing it back to the elements, let's jump into number three, which was
before we go to three, I'll add one last thing because I think I'm going to talk politics, which is certainly we're in a very divisive time, but I think the lesson is worthy of just mentioning. Yeah. And we just went really down the rabbit hole of like refining the messaging frame we believe is going to come down to nutrient density as a key tool. But I want to go back to the overall macro of like, we need to tell a different story here, which was the original premise of like, we can't lead with sustainability. And I think it's really interesting what I've been watching over Trump winning the election is like his alignment with RFK and the Maha movement and all that, and how I think you see the conservatives have really gotten behind that, whether it's real or not, we'll find out. But that's a group that did not get behind climate change. They did not get behind food and ag change for the sake of altruistic climate benefit, right? Because the message was help us save the planet, help us not have the world end. And instead now the message that like Maha and the other people involved there are really taking is you're poisoning our children. That's self-interest versus altruism. And so whatever emotion that all that inspires, I think it's just a really good illustration of refining the messaging frame is essential. And it goes back to that key theme of moving from the altruistic benefit to the self-interest benefit.
And just to say it out loud, for those who are not yet familiar with the Maha movement, that is the Make America Healthy Again movement, which I agree. It's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out over the next 4 years. And I think the way you frame that up, like in my mind, like the whole left and right thing is like, right is what's in it for me? How do I take care of myself? Whereas left is how do we take care of all, right? And I think to your point, if we can link that self-interest to regenerative agriculture, like, man, the power that could unlock is massive.
Yeah.
What I'll say is it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I'll leave it at
that. Yeah. Well, let's go to element number three. Element number three was double down on loyalty and share of wallet. Break that one down for us, Ryan.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that we heard as a truism was that it is often the case that investments in marketing messaging that talked about regeneratives, that talked about regenerative generally, and especially that talked about its sustainability benefits, when delivered to consumers who don't know what regenerative is, that advertising tends to have lower ROAS, lower performance across a number of metrics compared to core brand message activations and executions.
Yeah.
And which is unfortunately leading some brands to feel either a bit fatalistic, like I got to take one for the team, and spend money on this upper funnel messaging, even though I know it's not working that well, but it's for the good of everyone. Or they just stop spending on it altogether because it's not a good use of capital. But then the inverse thing, what we heard is that the inverse is also true, though, that if you introduce if you talk about regenerative to consumers who have already purchased your brand, or to consumers who have exhibited in some other way a curiosity about regen, or they're kind of regen adjacent, let's say, then that actually is quite effective as an investment tactic. And that from a marketing nerd standpoint, we think of that as middle funnel investment as opposed to upper funnel investment. So thinking about this from the vantage point of the brands themselves, the consensus view was, well, if some dollars can be moved down funnel into mid funnel tactics, and that's where we choose to talk about regenerative more intentionally, the ROI on that investment is likely to be better. And by the way, another component of that is there's a lot, regenerative has very low household penetration right now. I think we can all agree that is a fact, right?
Yep.
However, if you take the household penetration of each of those small brands and they cross promote so incredibly well that Kettle and Fire, buyers are also buying Lundberg Farms, who are also buying Simply, et cetera, that actually becomes a huge value unlock for each of those individual brands to maximize the revenue being generated, maximize the share of wallet amongst that relatively low sample size of people who are buying it. So the combination of those two things basically boils down to, hey, there's a lot of value to be created in maximizing our communication and maximizing our level of trial and purchase amongst people who have already started to show an interest in regenerative.
I love that. I mean, I really think about the power in the second piece you mentioned, and consumer X has 3 favorite regenerative brands, but they don't know that there's another 20 that exist, right? So they have the understanding, they have the commitment, they're willing to pay the premium. Like, how do we get them to understand that there are essentially every category you purchase food today, you can find a regenerative brand.
Exactly.
It's just it's harder to find, right? So I love that collective effort, that collaborative spirit of like, how do we kind of spread the wealth? And it just gets me really excited. I didn't have any of these questions. I just got pumped about it.
I try and think about this one slicing the funnel in half, right? And so if the top of the funnel is awareness and the bottom of the funnel is actual demand or purchase, right? Like tactically, the stuff that lives at that bottom of the funnel, we can help through the coalition and through the coalition brands working together to cross promote, like what you guys were just talking about. That awareness thing is more challenging because of the lack of marketing budget, like you alluded to a second ago, Ryan. And so to me, when I look at that, I moderated a conversation at RFSI Europe last year between a guy from Danone and Josephine from Omi, a small emerging brand in France. And they were really talking like, we need the big brands to drive awareness because they have the budget, they have the eyeballs, they have all the slots at retail. And then the emerging brands can kind of uphold the integrity and drive purchase and create these very loyal customers. I think that's true to some degree, but then we risk kind of the greenwashing that I think some of the larger multinational have with regen. So the unlock for me, as we've had this conversation, the light bulb moment for me has been retailers. Retailers have to play a major key role in that top level awareness, because if you go to Whole Foods right now and you look at any of their regenerative brands, they're talking about regen as a small insignia on the front of pack or as a small paragraph on the back of pack, or maybe. Think about that square footage if that becomes some sort of more better articulated and activated execution at all the Sprouts across the country, at all the Whole Foods across the country, at all the NCG and infra stores across the country. Like, these brands can't go buy billboards in those towns, but we can work with the retailers to create mini billboards in the stores. Right. And I think that's got to be the key unlock to the high level awareness, is like the retailers got to get on board and support these things. Which then obviously the purchase and demand's right there next to it, because the product's on the shelf down the aisle after you see the awareness driving sign or whatever. So we're obviously working on that too, but that was just a new like reframe and like an underpinning of like the absolute necessity of retailer engagement in that part of the work that was helpful for me that I wanted to share.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think we not only do retailers need to play that role, there's evidence that when they've chosen to play that role on other things in the past, they crush it. I mean, I remember when Whole Foods, this is over a decade ago, when Whole Foods made the decision that you're going to understand who the farmer is that you bought this produce from. and we're going to drive a linkage between, like we're going to be more transparent about our supply chain, and we're going to make you think about where your food was grown, and local and sourcing is going to be important to us. It changed what the produce section looked like. There was signage everywhere. And I bet money that if you did like a pre and post consumer survey for people who shop at Whole Foods, like 2 years before they rolled that out to 2 years after they rolled that out, the level of consumer understanding around sourcing, its importance, like who are the farmers, should I know the farmers, was probably meaningfully different. And it's just because they can execute really well when they make a decision that something's important to their business interest and also important to the broader mission that they intend to serve. So I hope, and not just hope, like I want to be part of conversations that help retailers like Whole Foods see that they have a tremendous opportunity here that's going to be a combination of self-interest and altruism that's a tremendous unlock for this movement.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm also shocked I'm the last person to join in this conversation of talking about the retailer piece. It's been like a thought I've had for numerous years. But I take it back to the non-GMO project. I remember when Whole Foods implemented the non-GMO project tag bib, and you had that bright orange tag in the middle of every single grocery shelf. And this goes directly back to what we just talked about with somebody who might buy a regenerative brand, Lumberg rice, for example, and they see a regenerative tag bib right there, and then as they walk the store, that same bib reiterates like, oh, this product also has these attributes. And it makes it that much easier to find instead of what's happening today, to AC's point, where you've got to look package by package, SKU by SKU to look for a tiny little bug call out to determine whether or not this is actually regenerative or not, whether or not it's more nutrient dense or not, or it impacts the climate in a positive way or not. It's just way too hard for the consumer to, number one, understand, and number two, to find the products that are supporting these sorts of farmers and brands.
Yep. Bingo.
Well, let's jump into number 4. Boldly collaborate for big awareness. I think we just kind of hit the tail end of a conversation with a convert. Man, I've just completely lost my train of thought. It's just gone. Sorry, we just finished we wrapped up a piece of the conversation about like a bold collaboration with Whole Foods and what that might look like for regenerative brands. But what are some of the other sort of collaborative efforts you mentioned in this bold, big awareness category, Ryan?
Yeah. So the big idea here is that we recognize that there's widespread recognition. Consensus view is that household awareness of regenerative is very low. There's some scary high estimates out there that we just, most people who we talked with do not believe is true. The truth is probably somewhere close to what Kiss the Ground found, which is like around 4%. And what that means is we've got a huge hill to climb with awareness. If we need to get it to a level, to the level necessary, that's going to drive demand like what we've been describing. And yet it's unrealistic to expect any individual brand to pull that off on their own. So the core insight here is that when we choose to collaborate, one of the places where we collaborate, the intention should be explicitly about increasing consumer demand. Like that collaboration has got to be focused on how we're going to, how we're going to increase consumer awareness specifically. If we're saying that individual brands can't necessarily handle the upper funnel, in investment load, then that should be absorbed by big collaborative efforts that move the needle in a significant way. So there are retailer specific ideas tied to that. Some of the ideas that we talk about in the white paper are building a multi-year, multi-channel national advertising campaign that would be collectively funded and centrally managed along the lines of what various trade associations have executed, like the Got Milk campaign from the dairy industry, or we can rattle off a whole host of other examples of that. Frankly, I think what Kiss the Ground has been doing is pretty close to building that kind of a multi-channel, sustained effort to drive top of mind awareness. Then there's some other ideas. I mean, one of the other ideas was really focused on converting the healthcare industry. And to tie this back to the probiotic conversation we were having earlier, I mean, if the science is there, what a tremendous shift it would be to have more nutritionists, more functional medicine experts, more, insurance, health insurers, more hospitals uh, advocating for regenerative food, choosing to buy regenerative food because they recognize the health benefits associated with it.
Mhm.
I love that idea. I love all of those ideas. And what immediately came to mind for me, and it's strange because this is not at all my wheelhouse, is like,
Mm,
the influencer push. If there's an influencer who is maybe 250K, 300K per post, instead of one of these brands trying to foot that whole budget, can we split that and maybe send that retailer into a store and like do a regenerative shop? Hit every aisle, pull all the regenerative brands off. That way, to your point, Ryan, you were disseminating that spend with
mhm.
a more influential figure that it would typically
Right,
be out of budget for an individual brand. And I think
right.
whether or not that would work, I don't know. I'm, again, not a
Hmm.
marketing guy, I'm a sales guy, but it
Hmm.
seems like plausibly could be a good play. But I'm curious
Hmm.
to get your perspective. You mentioned a couple other examples. What are some of like lower end, potentially feasible today for a collective of, let's call it 31 different regenerative brands? Like, what could they do together to try to raise awareness in some of those bold campaigns?
Yeah, well, I'll answer it this way, and I'm not going to share ideas that came out of that town hall, but I had the chance to be part of y'all's town hall a little
Yeah,
while ago, and I mean, how many ideas got generated on this specific topic? I mean, literally, I
a
think
lot.
this one had 40,
Mhm.
50 different discrete ways of potentially, yeah, of that community potentially collaborating on something that's bigger, let's call it. Like maybe it's not at the scale of a, $50 million national advertising
Mhm.
campaign, but certainly, there's some big opportunities for how those folks can collaborate. And I actually think one of the ideas that I remember being talked about in that space, just to build on what you just said, Kyle, because I think it is literally doable right now, is, hey, who's an influencer that none of us individually could afford to hire,
Mhm.
who actually cares about regenerative? And if we each put a little bit of money into a bucket, suddenly we can afford that influencer, and they become an ally for the movement, and you amortize their cost and the benefit associated with that cost across multiple brands. That is a concrete, and it seems to me very doable kind of an
Yeah.
execution for someone like y'all to coordinate.
Yeah, I agree. I think the challenge there is if you really want to have all 31 brands involved in something like that, getting that one influencer to convert out to 31 points of purchase, I think is challenging
Yeah,
e-commerce wise, especially with
yeah,
different categories, different products, different
yeah.
price points. But there's ways that can be handled. I mean, the big takeaway here for me is like what has what has been accomplished in our space in this vein to date. It's two things. It's two documentaries. It's Kiss the Ground and Common Ground.
Right.
Like there's tons of other stuff that's been done. It's been very beneficial, but really a big, bold collaboration that drove a shit ton of high level awareness. That's it. It's those two things. Those are both digital. So I think we need to start with something that's a human being experience in person to complement what's been accomplished by those two digital, and then follow something digital after we can nail some sort of human kind of event. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Five senses engaging specific experience.
Mm-hmm.
What that is, I don't know.
Yep.
And who pays for it, who organizes it, are all the things that we all know need to kind of be figured out. But um, I would love to see us start there because I
Mm-hmm.
also think if we can figure that out, we will be able to collaborate on the rest of it. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the test. Like that's the test for collaboration amongst this group that we're asking for more collaboration amongst. If we can
Mm-hmm.
prove we can do that, then all bets are off if we can do the rest of it. I think it's an easy yes after that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
at least in
Mm-hmm.
theory.
Ryan, I want to pick your brain on another marketing concept. From a sales perspective, when we explore a new opportunity, we got to factor in a few things to determine whether or not we want to pay for the slotting and do the trade promotions to ensure that this is going to have the right payoff, right? It's really quantitative. It's simple to, I shouldn't say simple, but it's really reasonable to do all this math, right? If you're anticipating XYZ velocity over Y period of time, you can
Mm-hmm.
afford Z slotting.
Mm-hmm.
Are there specific marketing guardrails like that we should quantify or kind of put any potential initiatives through like that rigorous math to say like, hey, this is what you want to be looking for as you start to develop these campaigns?
Mm-hmm,
Is
mm-hmm.
that like audience? Is that scope? Is that, cost? Like, I have no idea. Again, sales guy, not a marketing guy.
Yeah, yeah. One of the most important parts of building a marketing plan is being very explicit about the objective that you're trying to what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and to choose the right set of KPIs to tie to those to objectives. So the an an upper funnel kind of awareness driving campaign like what we've been talking about now is going to be measured against a different set of KPIs than what would be true if it was further down in the funnel. So I think the broad answer to that question is it depends. And and what I think the movement's opportunity, or what a brand's opportunity is, and and you guys as stewards of the coalition, is to be really invest a lot of rigor in defining the right set of objectives, getting alignment to the right set of objectives, so that once you so that you can tie KPIs to those, that everyone then feels like they're aligned to. Where a lot of not just collaborative efforts, but just sort of brand led efforts go sideways, is there wasn't sufficient clarity on what the true objectives are, what the realistic objectives were, which leads to disagreement in how to interpret the data on the back end.
Yeah, there's some good shit right there that I just wrote down that I'm not going to share, but that we're going to use moving forward. Well, man, this has been super, super fun, super enlightening. Can't wait to share this with our audience. I'm going to wrap with our typical last question, which I think is inclusive of a couple other questions that people are probably asking at this point in the episode, Ryan, which is one, the regular question: how do we get Regen brands to 50% market share by 2050? And I think what will be included in your answer is like, what has the feedback been you've gotten to this report, and what do we do next with the information that you've shared with the community?
Yeah, for sure. I knew this question was coming.
Well prepped.
Yeah, I'm going to be a broken record here. What it looks like to achieve that level of market share is that collaboration has to be our superpower. We have to figure out a couple of huge and impactful ways to pool our resources to accomplish things bigger than what any individual brand or stakeholder could have pulled off on their own. Without that, there's no scenario in which we get even remotely close to that kind of market share. Is my broad answer to that. And I think that the maybe more specific answer, the answer that's tied to what the white paper has found, and kind of what the feedback to it has been so far, is that there's a lot of energy around a few different pieces of it. In particular, I would say one is on that consumer insights part. I think that feels like a very tangible, or what I'm hearing is that feels like a very tangible and concrete way to operate in a collective and collaborative manner without a lot of incremental effort. Like if I've already conducted a study, it's not that much effort to figure out how to share all or part of that with a broader community, particularly if there's a third party like us or you guys kind of like helping to hold that space or broker that approach. So I'd say there's consumer research is a key part of it. I think the second piece that's gotten a lot of positive feedback, and where it feels like there's some low-hanging fruit and energy, is how to cross promote and build sort of like mini coalitions within the Regen brand space in a more intentional way. Like there are a number of brands who are natural partners, not just because they're regenerative or not just because they share the same certification, but because they share a use case. They probably already share some consumer households or overlap in recipes or whatever it is. Like there's an awful lot of just very obvious ways for smaller scale collaborations to be scaled up and have big impact. So I think that's a second place where there's been quite a lot of energy. And then the third is, I'm going to bring it back to that conversation that we had earlier. I get it that it's going to be hard. I get it that the level of data and science that's going to be necessary to unlock nutrient claims is a heavy lift. And it is also the holy grail, like that.
Yeah.
Figuring out how to think outside the box to get that done in a reasonable time frame and in a way that's actionable, even if it's just with one crop type. I mean, like, let's just solve this for milk, or I mean, like, whatever. Like, that is a tremendous opportunity that would be the short path to that kind of 50% market share number that you call out.
Totally agree with that, especially the last piece you mentioned. Like, I loved AC's analogy. Like, so if we have the number one pick, like, how do we build the team around that pick to have the highest likelihood of success, not for the individual, but for the collective, right?
Exactly.
Ryan,
exactly.
man, thank you so much for the time, for the energy, for the effort. So much gratitude. We appreciate your time and everything you're doing for the movement, and your willingness to take your expertise and kind of share that amongst, everybody in this space. It's really awesome. For anybody who wants to learn more about Ryan or the white paper, go to wearesmoketown.com. Check it out. It's a phenomenal read, although you just got a really high level summary, so I don't know if you're going to want to read it, but just in case. But just want to say thanks, man. That. Really appreciate the conversation today.
Yeah, Thank you for having me. I like I said, I'm a huge fan of what you guys are doing. I've been listening to this for I don't even know how long. It feels like for years, but then I'm like, how many years has it actually been? Like I'm a huge fan. Thank you for the grace that you've extended for welcoming me into this space and for then being a collaborator. Thank you.
You're a legend, brother. Appreciate you, man.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
For transcripts, show notes, and more information on this episode, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to future episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, the Regen Brands Weekly, and follow our Regen Brands LinkedIn page to stay in the know on all the latest news, insights, and perspectives from the world of regenerative CPG. Thanks so much for tuning into the Regen Brands podcast. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, your talent, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.